This episode of New Politics was released on the 19th of July, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Hello to our audience and hello to you, David. Lots of cold weather in Sydney this week, but the sun has been out and you cannot ask for much more than that.
When Sydney puts on a good day, it's one of the best days anywhere, and we've had a couple in a row. And we're a bit overdue for our next once-in-a-100-year rains that come every 3 or 4 weeks, so that's nice.
And we've got a lot to talk about today, David. We look at Anthony Albanese's state visit to China, and I think that that's been a big success. There's been a massive backlash against the anti-Semitism report released by Jillian Segal during the week, and we look at how that will affect the federal government. There was also an ambitious plan to build 1.2 million homes by 2030 to alleviate the housing crisis, but it looks like that might not be achieved. And David, everyone forgets about Tasmania, but we will not. And they've got a state election on the weekend, and we look at what's likely to happen, and that's all coming up in this big edition of New Politics.
I can't wait.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month, or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. During the week, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese met with the President of China, Xi Jinping, and it was the fourth meeting between the two, and it's a strategically significant meeting. And this isn't all just about diplomacy, it's about securing Australia's future in a region that is becoming more complicated every single day. The Albanese government has done a lot of work to reset the relationships with our biggest trading partner, but the Conservative media and the coalition are still stuck in that outdated Cold War mindset where China is still regarded as the biggest threat. There's always turmoil over there, or there's the possibility of war and invasion, while Albanese is going on and just creating the real opportunities for Australian exporters and for universities and for workers through clever trade and diplomatic processes. And all we get from the coalition and the mainstream media is this anti-China rhetoric. There's constant suspicion. There's a lot of sword rattling about a hypothetical war over Taiwan, and would Australia side with the United States in that event? And I just think that nobody wins if Australia becomes this pawn in a battle between China and the United States. Now, the coalition had a decade pretty much to diversify trade and assert Australia's independence, and they failed dismally and almost destroyed Australia's trade with China, and also got engaged with the failure of the AUKUS deal in 2021, which no one seems to understand what's in the agreement. And now that Labor is rebuilding a constructive relationship with Beijing and advancing Australia's interests, well, all of a sudden China is this big national security threat. And I think that in a world where the United States is increasingly volatile and unpredictable and China's influence is growing, I think that Albanese is playing this game carefully, and it's a game that values diplomacy, economic security, and it values Australia's interests rather than just this blind loyalty to the United States.
We've been hard on the Labor government, as really we should be. We should acknowledge when they do things right. And this is true when Liberals are in too. It's just that the Liberal Party, sadly and regrettably, did very little right. But the Labor Party has managed so far its relationship with China pretty well. It's a difficult course to navigate because we do have agreements with the US, not just the abhorrent AUKUS scheme, but other trade agreements and other. Now, with the current US government, everything's up in the air and nothing is certain. which you couldn't, even with George W. Bush. That was never the case. Australia always knew more or less where it stood with America. Yes, America has pushed what it wants from us and been taken more than it's given on cases, but to be really, really fair, that's international politics. And that's the way it goes. Under the Trump regime, it's much less predictable, it's much less stable, it's much less manageable. Whereas Xi in China, who's not an ideal leader by any standard, but there's a predictability and a stability there. Trustworthiness is probably too strong a word, but we know that the Chinese government isn't about to throw in Australian trade. And we hope and we think that the Australian government isn't about to throw away our biggest trading partner. The coalition, for some reason, and I think really the reason is, one, they're not that capable, sadly, but two, the dog whistle, which has worked for them so well in the past, is there when you talk about the Chinese threat. Someone on Twitter, I think, it might have been Blue Sky, pointed out that the press demands Anthony Albanese bring up the issue of human rights in China when he meets with Xi. Okay, fair enough, yes. Nobody ever asks if he brings up the issues of human rights with Donald Trump. And given what's happening in the state, people being deported and threatened to be deported even though they're full citizens and in some case were born in the United States, is a gross violation of human rights. Alligator Alcatraz, where they're putting people and essentially half-starving them. It's a gross and awful breach of human rights. So yeah, why doesn't he bring up that? And fair point, but no one ever asks him to do that. But with Xi or with any other Asian leader, if he doesn't talk about it, it's weak leadership and poor diplomacy.
And I think that this meeting is more than just a photo opportunity. And for me, it's a clear change of direction within the Australia-China relationship. And after that diplomatic freeze under the Morrison government, I think that this is exactly what needed to be done. And the export process has been cleared up. There's all of these barriers that were previously placed on Australian wine, barley, timber, coal, lobster. I think there were quite a few other things that had sanctions or high tariffs on them. Well, that's all gone now. And that supports a lot of Australian producers and regional communities within Australia. And Anthony Albanese and Jodie Hayden, they also had private dinners with Xi Jinping and his wife Peng Li Yuan, and she's a folk singer as well, so maybe they had a few sing-songs after the banquets that they had as well. And this has all been rubbished by the right-wing media as well. But having these strong personal relationships with such powerful leaders, or with such a powerful leader as Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping is certainly a lot smarter than someone like Donald Trump, but having this type of relationship with China is very good for Australia. And instead, what we get locally is outrage. Sky News and Murdoch Media, they accuse Albanese of appeasement, of selling out to Beijing, betraying Australian independence, even criticising Anthony Albanese for doing a media conference in China in front of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags.
One thing that surprised a lot of people, including me, during the PM's China visit is the backdrop to his press conference yesterday. Yep, even on an overseas trip, when he held a media conference, he wasn't satisfied with the Australian flag. He stood in front of three flags, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags as well. Why?
And generally, I don't think any of this is really going to undermine what Albanese is doing in China. I think he's decided, well, this is what's got to be done, and I'm just going to go ahead and do this. But I guess that, well, I'm mainly pointing it out just to highlight how most of the Australian media, and the coalition too, are completely paranoid about their relationship with China. And I don't know if this paranoia is just a leftover of that historical paranoia in Australia in the 19th and the 20th century, but I just thought that it would have been stopped by now.
They're an organisation that wishes to return to this idealised past. Maybe not as much as, say, One Nation or the various more extreme or right-wing groups who, as Paul Keating pointed out, long for a past that never existed. Those weren't his exact words, but that's what he meant. A past where there were no people of colour, there were no immigrants. Everyone was happy and everyone was wealthy. This has never existed.
Yeah, I can't remember those days, David.
No. And I guess it's nice to have a vision, but the vision has to be rooted in some kind of plausible reality. It becomes embarrassing. And while it's easy, I suppose, to look at the people who maybe look a bit different to us and who maybe approach things a little bit differently to us. And I'm not getting into the whole notion of human rights abuses, and that's an important thing. But I do think that building strong relationships with strong neighbours and being in a position where you can say, well, hey, you should treat these people better, or you should be more mindful of how you treat people, and you should release these political prisoners from jail. We don't have the economic muscle to be able to say, oh, we will stop trading with you. We don't have the military muscle to enforce it, and neither should we. But gently put, but firm criticism. But we do need to do it to the United States too, and probably in a more urgent way, because America has the tradition of being the land of the free, the purveyor of human rights, of being one of the world's model democracies, and we're not doing that. I guess what I'm saying is that we've got to have a press, and I say this every week, so say it with me, everyone, we've got to have a press that grows up and a better press.
And beyond this strong trade with China, and just for some context, China is Australia's number one trading partner at 27% of the entire export market, and that's valued at $180 billion per year. The United States, well, that's just at 4.6% of our export market, and that's valued at $30 billion. Now, that's still quite a lot of money, but in comparison with China, that's quite small. But it's almost the reverse with regional security. Not so much in the numbers, but just in the way that we look at America for defence and security. But whenever there's anything to do with China, there's always this talking up of China invading Taiwan as though it's going to happen tomorrow, or even invading Australia, that's going to happen tonight. And if this happens, well, what's Australia going to do about it? Is Australia going to join the United States in the war against China if China invades Taiwan? Here's an exchange between Monique Wright from the Seven Sunrise Program and James Lawrenson from the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology in Sydney.
Okay, let's talk about Taiwan first. We've been hearing about this potential conflict now for years. How likely are we to see Beijing try and take Taiwan by force?
Well, if you're asking me, I don't think it's very likely at all. And what we're hearing out of the Americans at the moment, to be honest, it's a bit nasty, because what they've waited for is for Albo to be on the ground in China and then demand that Australia line up with America in a war against China. And don't forget, Mon, this is a war that America hasn't even committed to.
Yeah, this is a hypothetical on a hypothetical, right?
Right.
Okay, if we're talking in hypotheticals, what would a conflict over Taiwan look like for our region?
Here's what the Prime Minister had to say about this.
I think it's important that we have a consistent position, which Australia has had for a long period of time. We support the status quo when it comes to Taiwan. We don't support any unilateral action there. We have a clear position, and we have been consistent about that. What's important when it comes to international relationships is that you have a stable, orderly, coherent position going forward. Australia does. We want peace and security in our region. We don't want any change to the status quo. That's Australia's position today. That was Australia's position last week. That's been a bipartisan position for a long period of time.
So, hypotheticals, David, I guess we always have to be prepared. What should we do if New Zealand becomes a hostile, communist Maori superpower and invades Tasmania? We need to be prepared, because that's a hypothetical. It might never happen, but it could happen at some point. So
Those Antarctican scientists locked away going slowly mad. Clearly they're going to do something aggressive and violent to Australia. It's the nearest country.
Well, it's very hypothetical, but we do need to be prepared for this hypothetical situation. So
they're very smart people and can make weapons from anything. I mean...
Well, that's right, but that's the level of stupidity that we get with all of this stuff. We had the barrage of these stupid hypotheticals, and it just extends that paranoia, or it's trying to get that gotcha moment or the scoop for the journalists, and it's all just really insane. And US military commanders are also pushing that narrative that we do need to be prepared for a possible conflict in Asia in 2027. And I guess when they mention Asia, they mean China. Why 2027? We're not sure. No one's really explained that. And the only reason that I can think of is that 2027.
It's those Bangladeshians in Asia, they're putting together a big army. 2027, it'll be ready.
Well, we better watch it. But the only reason that I can think of is that 2027 would be the lead up to...
And hello to all our Bangladeshian listeners. I'm joking, of course.
But that would be the lead up to the election year in the United States, which would be 2028. So the Republicans might want to create some sort of skirmish there or trouble in Southeast Asia just to boost their election chances. But aside from that, it's just not going to happen. And Australia is probably caught between two powers at the moment. But I think that with clever diplomacy, it might be able to get the best of both worlds. And that's what diplomacy is all about, getting the best out of all worlds, really. And I think that Albanese might be able to create an even stronger economic and diplomatic link with China. And who knows, that might create an avenue and a link towards the BRICS movement, which is starting to get a lot of momentum as a counterbalance to the hegemony and control of the United States. And I just think that opens up a lot of creative possibilities within global geopolitics. And this is coming at a time when the power of the United States is starting to fade. And under Donald Trump, it is starting to fade quite quickly. And that's surprising a lot of people and analysts as well. But I think that we just have to stop being so fearful of China. Gough Whitlam opened up that pathway for Australia all the way back in 1971. And that was even before he became the Prime Minister, David. He did go to China a couple of times in 1973 while he was Prime Minister, but this started a long, long time ago. And I think that Anthony Albanese is just adding to this process, and I can only see benefits for Australia going well into the future.
He got laughed at for going to China. Then Richard Nixon went. He was ahead of Nixon in getting over there and seeing the importance of China and the desirability of China to be part of a peaceful relationship rather than being an antagonistic one. And yes, Nixon was corrupt and what have you, but with the benefit of hindsight, even quite leftish or liberal, as they call them in the States, historians will say that Nixon, it was probably his greatest achievement as president, opening up those ties with China. And yeah, Gough Whitlam was weeks or months ahead of him. And Paul Keating, of course, always spoke of the importance of Australia really being an Asian country, which drove the more traditionally minded amongst politicians and pollsters and pundits. That always irked them, but I think he was right. I can criticise Paul Keating up and down the wall, but on that he was absolutely right, that Australia needed to think about, one, not only where it stood politically in the world, that it was not really part of a mega power system, but was a middling power, but where it was in the world as well. It was a middling power, but a major power in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, when we look at it from that point of view, Australia has a big role to play in world affairs and antagonising the Chinese. And they showed us under Abbott and Morrison particularly, and Turnbull to a lesser extent, that we needed them more than they needed us. And we've either got to grow up or live in our bedrooms pretending that it's still 1950 and that nice Mr. Menzies has it all covered for us.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
The fallout from the report on anti-Semitism that was released last week continues, and that's the report produced by the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism, Jillian Segal. And most of the criticism of this report is that it's less about protecting Jewish Australians from bigotry and genuine anti-Semitism, and more about shielding the State of Israel from public criticism of its genocide, human rights abuses and war crimes in Palestine. Now, if Jillian Segal's recommendations are implemented, I just think that it would take us into a very dangerous territory where questioning apartheid, questioning occupation or questioning genocide in Gaza could be branded as hate speech, where public institutions lose funding for platforming dissenting voices. And I think this is where the line between racism and genuine discussion about key political issues is becoming blurred, and would become even more blurred if it's supported through federal legislation. And the other point is that it's not as though Jillian Segal is some kind of benevolent, neutral observer. She was the head of the right-wing and very conservative Executive Council of Australian Jewry and a close ally of Australia's most powerful pro-Israel lobby groups. And her ties to pro-Israel lobbying and far-right donors raises very serious questions about the credibility of this report and the political motivations behind it. Now, if Australia wants to have a serious conversation about anti-Semitism, and so far it's just been messed up by the Israel lobby groups and Zionist activists, well, it can't come at the cost of truth, it can't come at the cost of protest, and it can't come at the cost of democracy.
There were those of us who questioned the need for a particular anti-Semitism envoy. All of the things that you'd rightly be worried about, let's be fair, were covered by various laws anyway. You're not allowed to threaten people with violence. You're not allowed to call people racial names. That's banned under the law. They tried to change the law. The Liberal government tried to change the law to get Andrew Bolt out of being called a racist by the law courts. This is sadly, as it should be. We shouldn't need these laws because these things shouldn't be a part of our thinking. But unfortunately, we live in a world where it is common enough that people are being vilified for the colour of their skin, for the traditional clothes that they wear, for the language that they speak, for the accent that they have. This is absolutely wrong and it shouldn't be. And as I said, we shouldn't need these laws because they shouldn't be necessary. Unfortunately, they are necessary. The anti-Semitism, and then there's also the Muslim envoy who hasn't seemed to have been very prominent. I'll put it that way. And it seems that he was only appointed because there was pressure to not have just an anti-Semite one. Now, she brings out this, they're now calling it ambit claims, where they should be allowed to go through university courses and determine whether they're anti-Semitic or not. Would a critique of the formation of Israel in 1948 be considered anti-Semitic? Is it anti-Semitic to say, oh, maybe extrajudicial arrests on foreign soils, which they did for war criminals, should that be allowed? Shouldn't you deal with the local authorities and go through a due process? I'm just bringing up these things as things that might be criticised. I'm not saying that this is what should have happened or this isn't what should have happened. And again, I'm not pinpointing people of the Jewish faith or Jewish background. They are fully valid members of the human race who deserve as much of the privileges as human race as everybody else deserves. What also happened is that a few people have pointed out, hold on, these people now have a voice to Parliament. Indigenous people in Australia do not have a voice to Parliament. And in fact, we had a referendum that comprehensively rejected the idea, as appalling as that was, but that's what happened. Suddenly, this person comes along and says, this is what we want. Now, I suspect none of it will be adopted. I'm pretty sure the government isn't that suicidal. I think she overplayed her cards. And even if it was an ambit claim, it was a pretty severe ambit claim. And it wasn't the way to stamp your colours to the flag.
Oh, but I think there is some relevance to, or quite a lot of relevance to the Voice to Parliament referendum from 2023, where a lot of the most vocal opposition from right-wing groups was this idea of giving special privileges to one group of people in Australia, and that's Indigenous people. But at least we had the referendum for that, and I agree with you, David. I wasn't happy with the outcome, but at least we had a vote for that. But in this case, we've got one very powerful voice, Jillian Segal, who's got the ear of government and who was not really a neutral observer on this and trying to get special privileges for some of the most powerful and most privileged people in the country. Now, Jillian Segal, she is the immediate past president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, and that's a very right-wing and very conservative group of Zionists. And the investigative journalist Anthony Clan revealed during the week that Jillian Segal's partner, John Roth, he donated $50,000 to the Advance Australia group, and that's the right-wing lobby group that's repeatedly attacked multiculturalism, climate science. They were very active during the Voice to Parliament referendum itself, and Jillian Segal has denied any knowledge of this donation and said that it's not up to her to comment on her husband's political opinions or how he spends his money. And the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke, was asked about this issue.
I wasn't aware of it until the reports came out, and I'd say two things. First of all, Advance is an appalling organisation, and that organisation does the opposite of pursuing social cohesion. And you can go through a long list of people who they try to push to the margins and a long list of tropes that they're guilty of using. But I have no time for that organisation at all. Secondly, where it's a long time since we've been a country where you would blame a woman for decisions of her husband. And so with that in mind, I don't think she's answerable for her husband. She said she didn't know about it, and I've got no reason to do anything other than believe her.
And David, I think this might actually be plausible because these people are absolutely loaded. They paid $30 million for their property in Darling Point several years ago, and $50,000 donated to one of their favourite right-wing causes. Well, that would have been like loose change, so I can imagine it would have been easy to forget. But the other point is that subsequent to all of this, Jillian Segal, she didn't condemn the Advance Group or condemn that donation of $50,000. And these people are just really divisive people. They're trying to seek even more division, and either by trying to influence the government in setting up these extreme powers to close down debate on what Israel is doing in Gaza, or by funding these right-wing propagandists to do the dirty work on their behalf. So Tony Burke might say that he trusts her, but I just think that all of this is already starting to blow up in the Labor government's face. And Albanese should have closed this down a long, long time ago. He might not have been able to do this anyway, because you can imagine that the outrage that would have ensued if he did try and close it all down or just dismiss the recommendations that are being proposed. But this has got the potential to blow up in the face of the Labor government, and I just don't know what Albanese can do in this situation.
What I suspect might happen, and I don't know, is that the position will be quietly folded down and either put away or quietly restructured with someone less controversial. I don't think anybody believes that her husband paid $50,000 to an organisation without at least letting her know that he moved $50,000 out of the personal wealth of the family. Even if you're a billionaire, it's still a fairly significant amount of money to transfer. If it had been $500, I think I'd probably be on her side saying, yeah, she might not know that. Even $5,000.
Well, for you and me, it's like dropping 10 cents on the pavement and thinking, oh, can I be bothered picking that up?
Yeah, dropping $20 and it costs more to turn around and pick it up than just wait for the interest to accumulate. Yes, I think they'll quietly remove her from the position and get in someone with hopefully more moderate views, or scrap the position together because, again, under the legislation of Australia, it's not really needed.
And the other part of this issue is that there's no clear definition of what anti-Semitism is. There is that definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which also includes criticism of Israel or Zionism as anti-Semitism, and that's the definition that Jillian Segal wants to include within her recommendations. But that particular definition is not law in Australia, but it is being used to police language and ideas in Australia, and in countries where this definition has been adopted into law, such as Britain, the United States and in Germany. I'm not sure if there's any other places that have adopted that into law, But in those countries, we've seen it weaponised and used to silence dissent, and that includes academics, activists, journalists, and the Palestine Action Group in the UK. Well, that was defined as a terrorist organisation just a few weeks ago by the British Parliament. So my feeling is that if this is what combating anti-Semitism really means, well, no, we don't want to have anything to do with that. Will it mean cuts to university funding if a lecturer questions Israeli policy, as you suggested before, David, or writes a paper about it? Will they get sacked? And that's already happened with Tim Anderson at the University of Sydney. Council libraries and art festivals being defunded or dismissed for platforming Palestinian perspectives. Sydney Writers' Week, they highlighted a few Palestinian authors a couple of months ago. Will they get dismissed as well, or will they be defunded? What happens there? Will they be closed down as well? Legal Aid in New South Wales, well, their staff were told recently not to discuss Palestine at all, and no prizes for guessing the background of the CEO at the Legal Aid New South Wales. And the other point is that these people are the extremists within the Jewish community, and it's a far-right perspective. Why don't we hear the voices of the progressive Jewish people, like the Australian Jewish Council? Why didn't the government invite them along to hear their perspectives? And these are the Jewish people in Australia who strongly oppose the occupation of Palestine. These are the Jewish people who strongly condemn the human rights abuses and condemn the war crimes being committed by Israel. Why is the government not listening to these people? Why have they only got the hardline Zionist organisations and giving them a seat at the table? And this is all about reducing public debate and actually criminalising criticism of the state of Israel. And David, I think there might be a knock on my door. It could be a police officer, but I'll go and check that later on. But I think that if Anthony Albanese adopts these recommendations, you suggest that he might quietly let these fade away and hope that no one realises that. But I think that if Anthony Albanese adopts these recommendations and actually creates legislation from them, I just think it's going to create a lot of political problems for him down the track, as well as a lot of legal problems for the community. And I don't think this can be allowed to happen.
Your envoys shouldn't be creating legal hassles. They should be easing things. They should be letting us know that it's okay to criticise a government, but you criticise a government on its policies and maybe on the character of individuals in that government. But it's not okay to say that Netanyahu is a bad person because he's Jewish. That's got nothing to do with whether he's a bad person or not. And it looks like today he's lost the government, so we'll see what happens over the next few weeks. I'm thinking of someone like Dave Sharma in Australia. He's a Jewish senator now, isn't he? Got into the Senate after failing. It's okay to criticise Dave Sharma, but not his Jewishness, or Josh Frydenberg's Jewishness, or Anthony Albanese's Catholicism, or Anthony Albanese's Italian background, or Irish background. Yes, criticise his ideas, criticise his allegiances, criticise his behaviour if he does anything wrong. And let's be fair, he's been fairly blameless on a personal level, mostly. There's been no major scandals like Scott Morrison, for example, who we shouldn't criticise for being an Anglo male, but we can criticise him for a whole range of other things. And it comes to the point where if you're doing your job properly, or if you're doing the job of critique properly, you don't need to criticise backgrounds, because they are irrelevant to the behaviour and the actions of governments and politicians in those governments. You see a lot of criticism of Noel Pearson, say, who you might disagree with his ideas. And he was a very strong advocate for Indigenous people. Now, not every Indigenous person agreed with him. It wasn't because he was born an Indigenous man that makes you agree or disagree with his policies. It's, are those policies any good? Now, those lines can be blurred a bit, particularly if you don't look at it closely enough. But that's what the anti-Semitism envoy should be saying. Yes, this criticism of Israeli government, even if I disagree with it, is okay, because ideas are okay to critique. Calling Netanyahu or any of his cabinet racist and anti-Semitic names, for example, is wrong and should be wrong.
But we can call them out for their war crimes and genocide.
Absolutely, yeah. You wouldn't call van der Leyen of Germany a kraut or anything like that, and you shouldn't. But the criticism of the German government is valid. Criticism of the Australian government, my God, is it valid?
Well, that's what we do every week, David.
It's about teaching people how to debate, how to argue. And you can be passionate, and you can be angry, and you can use bad words, and you can yell and scream and all of that. But the second it becomes racial, you've crossed that line. And it shows that you have a paucity of thought in you that won't see people as being essentially equal. That the differences aren't in the backgrounds or of their faith or of their family background. The difference is in how they approach the world.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
Just a few months ago, in the lead up to the 2025 federal election, housing affordability and the supply of housing was a big issue. It was dominating talkback radio, it was a regular feature on the campaign trail, and every news bulletin was attacking the Labor government for not doing enough on housing affordability, and everyone had an opinion about what to do. And I think, David, we had about 500 opinions floating around at that particular time about what should be done about housing. But since the Labor government was returned in May with a massive majority, housing just has not been mentioned at all. And just because it's not being talked about, it doesn't mean that the problem has gone away. But during the week, a leaked and redacted report from Treasury was sent to the ABC by mistake, and we'll leave it up to others to judge whether it was a mistake or done deliberately. But the report has suggested that the massive target the government set for itself in 2023, and that was to create 1.2 million new homes by 2030, that's not going to be achieved. And the Property Council of Australia suggests that we'll end up being around 460,000 homes short. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, still insists that the government is still on track to achieve this number.
We've already made it really clear that we will need to do more to meet our housing targets. We're investing tens of billions of dollars. We're working well with the states and territories and local governments. We're engaging with the industry. We're trying to get the capital flowing. I've changed the tax arrangements for build to rent. There are a whole range of things that we're doing and that Claire is doing, which will make an important contribution to achieving that target. But we'll need to do better and we'll need to do more. And the advice just reflects that. We have to be ambitious in housing, and we are. You know, I think it would be strange if a government like ours saw the obvious challenges in housing and decided anything other than to try and be ambitious about building many more homes for people. You know, I find it strange that people want to limit our ambition when it comes to housing. You know, we'd rather have a big, ambitious, difficult target and work around the clock to meet it in all of the ways that I've run through today, than to continue the approach of our predecessors, which was to build too few homes.
And David, we don't want to wait until 2030 to find out who's right or wrong with this issue. Through the National Housing Accord target that was agreed to by the states and territories in 2023, the federal government promised $3 billion in grants, incentive payments and direct funding to the states, territories, local councils and community housing providers to achieve these targets, but without reforms to planning laws and better coordination and a real cultural shift in how Australia thinks about housing, it's more than likely that the target of 1.2 million new homes isn't going to be achieved. And this isn't all necessarily about homes. It's about how we live in more compact, affordable, connected housing that's close to jobs and services. And that's certainly what the New South Wales government is trying to achieve. And it's also about creating all the infrastructure that's needed to support these new homes as well. But the government will have to start fast-tracking this process soon because it's less than 5 years away.
Say it with me. Neoliberalism is to blame. Making housing a commodity that was a short to medium term investment was always the problem. And they're now in a point where they feel they can't do much about it because people who have a home might lose value in that home. And people who don't have a home, they mightn't be able to get them into a home in a politically expediently fast enough way to do it anyway. Public housing is the solution. And they're trying to keep away from public housing altogether, but developers don't like it. You can't make any money from it. And governments think that it's too expensive, but it is an investment. Stability in accommodation is key to a healthy populace. It's probably a 20-year project to make it that it's not embarrassing or shameful or somehow lesser to live in public housing. We've got to start removing the stigma that if you have less money than someone else, you are somehow less of a person. I always quite liked Dorothy Parker's thinking on money. If you want to know what God thinks of money, just look at the people he gives it to. I think that's just become more true as we've gone along. And I think we need a government that demonstrates that every Australian has a value that is more than money, that you have a value just for being here. And that if you break the law, you go to jail, etc., or you get fined or consequences for inappropriate behaviour. But I think we have to look at the many, many good law-abiding people who are struggling in housing. We have rental laws that can be quite brutal on the renter. You can be evicted at any time. Now, some states have started to ameliorate this with laws that state that you can't just kick someone out for no reason. But at least that's a start. You can't just decide to up and get rid of your tenants because you think you can get more rent from someone else.
Well, it is a difficult issue, especially in a place like Sydney. I've got a friend whose daughter is a doctor and her partner works for Google as a programmer, and they're paying around $15.50 per week for a small place in Erskineville, and they can't afford it. And these are high-income professional people that cannot afford to live in Sydney. So something needs to be done about that as well.
Yeah, just rising wages won't help. I think we should raise wages, don't get me wrong, I'm not. But that's not the only thing that's got to happen. We've got to get our head out of the idea that housing is for investment and how much growth your house has. The magazines like Domain don't help the issue by having everything as a look how much we sold this place for. Look how much this place is going to get. There's only 2 suburbs in Sydney, and there's about 4 in Melbourne where you can live on the minimum award and rent a house on the minimum award. Everywhere else, you can't. And that enough vested interests don't see this as a problem compounds the problem.
And for some time, Australia has been building around 150,000 new homes each year, and that's a net change and takes into account homes that have been demolished and just replaced. So they're not part of that figure. This is a net number. And over the past decade, that number has gone up to 180,000 per year, and that's primarily because of population growth and other things that are happening within the economy and within the population. But to meet the government's ambitious target of 1.2 million homes by 2030, we'll need to add around 250,000 new homes each year to the national housing stock. And we'll have to do that for the next 5 years. And the Property Council of Australia, well, they've got a vested interest in this number. They're the ones that have been suggesting that the number will be a shortfall of 460,000, and they can then use their research to hammer the government with and keep promoting building and construction and those sort of issues. But other analysts are suggesting that the number is closer to 260,000. But by the way, whether it's 460,000 or 260,000, that's still a shortfall. And homes, in the way that we think about them at the moment within Australia, the development of these sort of homes, they just don't appear out of nowhere, out of thin air. They take years to plan, approve and build, and large apartment projects can take 5 years just to get the planning approvals. And even then we need the tradespeople, the materials, the right tax and policy settings, and then there's the cumbersome planning and zoning regulations of local councils, which seem to be quite different within each local council area and within each state. So the first barrier, as far as I can see, is it's a legal process, changing planning laws to actually allow more density in the right areas. And of course, there's going to be local resistance to some of these density issues. And The next barrier is a psychological barrier. Australia just has to rethink what a home actually is, and that means being more open to modular housing, prefab buildings, tiny homes, and these are all viable options when they are done correctly and done very well. And then there's the size issue. Australia has got the biggest houses in the world. We're the gold medalists in this competition. The average new home today is 236 square metres, and the US is next in line. They're around 220 square metres on average. And in the 1960s, the average size of a home was just 100 square metres, and that was when families were actually much larger as well. So smaller, smarter, faster to build homes, that needs to become part of the national conversation about housing. It also needs to be part of the government's thinking as well. And the housing crisis, well, it hasn't really gone away just because we're not talking about it. And it's not about that number of 1.2 million by 2030. It's about the quality of housing. It's about changing the culture of housing. And it's about using a bit more creative imagination on housing.
Yeah, we're stuck in that model of housing is this and this only. You either own it and you make money from it, or you don't and you're excluded from it forever. And yeah, you're absolutely right. This attitude has to change.
There is an election in Tasmania this weekend, and by the time people listen to this episode of New Politics, that election might all be over, or it might be very unclear and unresolved, and it might be a case where no one will know what's going on for the next few months. And I suspect that it's probably going to be the latter rather than the former. The Liberal Party had a vote of no confidence passed against it a few months ago, and that's why we've got this snap election. But for a party that had a vote of no confidence against it and had a lot of resignations, there was a lot of mayhem and dysfunction within that government, it's actually polling very well. In the latest opinion polls, it's polling at 35%, that's for the Liberal Party. The Labor Party is polling at 25%, and the Greens are polling at 15%. But there is the Hare-Clark voting system in Tasmania, and no one party is likely to be assured a majority, especially on these numbers. And independent candidates are polling at around 20%. And we have to have the caveat, the opinion polling in Tasmania is very, very unreliable. But because the Liberal Party and the Labor Party have said that they won't govern with the Greens, although the Labor Party has implied that they might do that if it ends up coming to that, it might end up being a patchwork of a major party and independents. And it's hard to know how that will work, because that's the situation that has resulted in the dysfunction that we've seen in Tasmania over the past couple of years. And a new election result might not actually change that. The $1 billion football stadium in Hobart and the AFL team that they're planning to set up in Tasmania, well, that's been a big and divisive issue down there. But just as we saw in the federal election last month, where the Liberal Party lost all of their seats in Tasmania, I think we might be in for a few surprises in this election. I don't know what that will be, otherwise it wouldn't be a surprise, but I think there will be a few surprises.
Certainly Hare-Clark makes things fairer, that's the first thing I'll say, but also makes things less predictable when you're used to more straightforward electoral systems like the preferential system we have at a federal level. I really can't see how the Liberal Party can win, given the dysfunction that they've shown over the last few years. Having said that, Labor hasn't staked a claim as being the alternative. And this is where Hare-Clark sorts things out, really, in that you get your multi-member representations. And I'm inclined to think that you're right here, that there'll be a patchwork of probably a Labor minority government with a Green coalition.
No, I think there might not be enough seats for them, because they will take them up to 16. I think you need 18 for a majority in Tasmania. So it will have to be a coalition of a coalition. They'll need to have a few more independents on top of that to get the numbers up to 18.
It's not out of the question. that we get a Liberal-Labor coalition. I don't think that's very likely, but it's not impossible because it might be the way that the numbers go.
Well, for me, it's almost like there's a system down there, which is the Hare-Clark system, but the politicians that make up that system are not equipped to deal with that. Their line of thinking is more like the two-party preferred system, and a Hare-Clark proportional representational system just requires different political thinking, and they just haven't really adapted to that, even though the system has been in place for many, many, many years.
Yeah, no, it's a complex system. There's no doubt about that. It's a system that's harder to manipulate than the federal system or the state systems. And by that, I'm not implying fraud or dishonesty. You can work on your preferences and getting those second and third preferences in a way that means that it's advantageous to you, which is, Labor in the last federal election. Again, it's not cheating, it's not rorting the system, but it's working out how you can get your preferences to flow to you rather than the other side. It's harder to do that under Hare-Clark. And yes, I think you're right. The politicians in Tasmania haven't quite worked out how to do it under Hare-Clark. But I'll be fair, it's a very fair system. It probably reflects the will of the voting public more than the federal system does, or the New South Wales or Victorian state systems do. So it will be interesting to see what happens.
So vote early, vote often, and we might get a result from this Tasmania election in about 2 or 3 months' time.
And we'll be the first ones to talk about it.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.